get into the narrative part of what I have to say, I want to talk about shared death experiences now. You know, I've had a conversation for about the last 10 or so years. I've had this recurrent conversation with a lot of people my age who are in various professions. And in a profession, things happen to you, or you're involved in various kinds of medical things, for example, okay, medical treatment of people. And things happen that you say that just because of confidentiality, never are you going to be able to talk about this very interesting thing that happened. But then what happens, the decades roll by, and then after a few decades you realize, oh my God, all the other people involved in that are dead. So why? So basically, I have been interested in these shared death experiences for a long time, and it goes back to when I was a medical student at the Medical College of Georgia. One of my own wonderful professors told me about her own shared death experience as she was resuscitating her own mother. And she had a lot of these things that I was by then identifying as near-death experiences. But she hadn't been near death. She was just there, sadly, onto the situation where her mother had a cardiac arrest right in front of her. But she was trying to resuscitate her mother, and in that interim said she left her body and she could see herself trying to resuscitate her mother down below, and she saw her mother now in spirit form, to use her phrase, and she saw her mother go and join these other people, some of whom she recognized as people who her mother had known while this physician was still alive, relatives and so on who had passed away. And other people there she didn't know who they were, but she figured they must have been people that her mother had known before she was born. But she herself, this physician, was born. And then they sort of all got sucked back into this tunnel or tube, and it closed off and so on. But since that time, I've spent a lot of time talking with people with these shared death experiences. And I observed something very interesting, and that was that from the late 70s through the 80s, I was hearing these almost exclusively from medical personnel, doctors and nurses. And then kind of in the mid-80s, roughly, it seemed to shift over, and I was hearing a lot more of them from people who had been there at the bedside when a relative had died or a loved one had died. That shift was connected with the concurrent shift in hospital practice. When I entered medical school, the standard routine was that when the patient was dying, the doctors and nurses would come in and escort the family out of the room on the idea that it was too overwhelming for the family, and the doctors and nurses would take charge. Whereas now the hospital practice is almost entirely opposite from that. The doctors and nurses encourage the family to be there. And concurrently with that, I saw a shift of these shared death experiences from medical personnel to where they are now, which is mostly people who were there at the bedside when a dying loved one. And what I came to see about these narratives over a period of time, or these stories, is that they are identical to the near-death experience. That all of the features that I identified as in the initial near-death experiences that I studied years ago are also present in people who have these experiences at the bedside, who incidentally are not ill or injured. There's nothing wrong with the oxygen flow to their brain. And yet they have identically the same experiences that I hear from people who did come close to death and were resuscitated, for example. And what are they? Well, one of the most common features of this is that people say that they see the spirit of the dying leave the body. And this is really among some of the first ones I heard back in the late 70s and 80s were from medical doctors who reported this to me, that as a patient died, that they would see something leave the body. And there's two kinds of major ways of looking at this. Some people talk about it as though it's a transparent replica of the person, kind of, that stands up and moves away. Or other people talk about it as a very structured light that seems to leave the body, sometimes maybe described as golden or grayish in color, and leaves. In some cases I've had where people say it just leads through the ceiling. The kind of pattern that you were just heard here of somebody at the bedside of the dying who says that as the person in the bed dies, the bystander leaves their own physical body and seems to accompany the dying person partway toward this light or into some other dimension. And change of geometry of the room. I hear this all the time. People say that suddenly, as grandma or whoever died, they were no longer in a regular three-dimensional cubicle structure of a hospital room, but rather in some other kind of geometry, which they find very difficult to describe, that the room changes shape. That light fills the room. I hear this one a lot. This beautiful light sort of shines throughout the room. I've had cases where people will say initially they thought it was something from the outside of the hospital, like a bright light reflected into the room. But then as this develops, they realize, no, this is not a regular light, but this light fills up the room. Music is something I hear. One or more people at the bedside will talk about this ethereal, otherworldly, beautiful music that seems to fill the room. Seeing into some other realm. I've had cases where people say that it's like a portal or a window opens up and they see what seems to be some other dimension of reality, of existence. And then most remarkable to me, this is one I just keep, just scratching my head on this one, but I have enough cases now where I'm completely confident that anybody who really, is interested in finding cases of this will be able to do so. And that's cases in which the bystander experiences the life review of the person who is dying. That's rather an intrusion, if you ask me, but people say, incidentally, that it doesn't have that feature of intrusiveness when it actually happens, that it instead is just completely natural. The most memorable case of this is a woman I knew in Carrollton, Georgia, where I used to teach psychology. This is an elderly woman who had had one of these Sturgay marriages. The fourth kind of Greek love, which is, the three that we all know, but actually the Greeks had another category of Sturgay love, where they had observed, which still happens in little towns, that maybe two kids, boy and a girl on adjacent farms, just grow up in a relationship, and they are playmates together, and it sort of naturally evolves into a marriage. And as my experience as a grief counselor makes me see that this is the very most difficult situation to deal with when you have somebody grieving, because that kind of relationship it creates a bond, which in the cases I've seen, it's just very rare, I think, for somebody who has lived a decades-long marriage with somebody that they literally were friends with from childhood. I mean, this is a very difficult situation when one person in the couple dies. And this was a perfect example of this. This woman had literally her husband in this little town was the neighbor, and they grew up with each other. And then after a decades-long marriage, he was diagnosed with a very rapid-acting lung cancer. And so as he was on his deathbed and in the process of passing away, his entire life sprang up around them in a vision. And she says, incidentally, she said she was talking with her husband about this back and forth. And they were talking about these different scenes. Some of it was stuff that she had, most of it was stuff that she knew about because she had lived a full life with him, but she said there were areas of this that she had not known about him. And she said throughout this, there was this presence of complete love and compassion that she, being from small town Georgia, identified as Christ. And she said there was one episode they had never had any children as long as they were married, but before they got married, there was a miscarriage, a spontaneous miscarriage. And she, after that, never got pregnant again. But she said throughout their marriage, they used to talk about this child that they lost, and they talked about the child as though it were a he. But she said in this vision, the child that they had emerged, she said, from that area of this panorama. This child emerged as this little presence of light that came out and identified herself to them as their daughter. My point being here that you're going to be able to find cases of this if you're interested. There are cases in which the bystander will actually empathically co-live the life review of the person who passes away. Now, to me, I don't see any means or any clear means of distinguishing that from a near-death experience. If all the components are the same, it seems to me that the fact that somebody is dying or being resuscitated is just a contingent thing. So that really here we're dealing with something here which does not necessarily have to do with somebody physically almost dying. They can have the same kind of experience when they are in the presence of someone who is physically dying. And if you think about it, I think basically as once this kind of sinks in, I think it's we're going to have to be in for a major modification of the standard format of debating about these things, because it's cast as a debate between the believers who look at this and say prima facie that, this is evidence of an afterlife. And then on the other hand, the group who call themselves the skeptics, which is sad because they are nothing of the sort, but what that group tells us is that, oh yeah, this is just the chemistry of the brain. As the oxygen is deprived, it throws up this hallucinatory phenomenon, and that's what's reported as a near-death experience. So I think it's time to kind of move beyond that category and say, well, yeah, this same phenomenon occurs also to people around the bedside, as we just heard a beautiful case of it this morning. That's one thing I think we gotta do, is to sort of rework the narrative format for this. There's a lot of other kind of narratives that we can bring in, not just stories of people who almost die and get resuscitated, but also people who have the identical experience when they are in the presence of someone who passes away.